Okay, so hello everyone. I'm hoping that this is working. I'm not on the YouTube live stream anymore. I'm just coming through the Zoom meeting, so hopefully, fingers crossed, everything goes okay. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that's going to be okay for us to get the ball rolling for the symposium. So I'm hoping that everyone can see the screen okay. If not, hopefully someone can let me know on the Zoom chat. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for inviting me to speak to you in more depth about my work. I recently joined the School of Liberal Education here at the University of Lethbridge, located in Treaty 7 territory in the homelands of the Sakai-Satapi Blackfoot Confederacy. I recently completed my doctoral work at Carleton University in the unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation, and I was born and raised in Treaty 6 territory in what is presently known as Edmonton, Alberta. And I name the Indigenous lands that I've lived on because in my work, I try to draw attention to the ongoing practices of settler colonialism. And part of that for me is reflecting on how engaging in a critique of settler colonialism while relocating and resettling in many ways on different Indigenous territories is part of the project of settler colonialism itself. Today, I'll be sharing some of the findings of my recent doctoral work, which, as Shelley noted, focused on questions of accountability and transparency in provincial child death inquiries across Canada, and considered the ways that accountability and transparency are shaped and reshaped by political rationalities like neoliberalism, as well as forms of governance like settler colonialism. So I'm hoping the screen share is still working. The slides are moving along as I'm going. So just to cover some quick goals of where I'm going to go today in the presentation, it's going to be fairly general. I want to share some of the hypotheses and reflections from my previous work interrogating accountability and transparency. And then I want to emphasize the significance of these political values in a more general way, both by pointing to critical policy studies, for example, and critiques of new public management, and then by drawing out connections between my work, between the symposium's theme of opening the university. And so I should say that while it might appear that I'm quite skeptical of accountability and transparency and openness more broadly, what I'm really trying to do is ask questions about the possibilities and perils that these ideas have as they move through and into institutional spaces that are already overdetermined with meanings that shape how exactly transparency and openness play out. So in other words, I'm cautious to accept accountability, transparency, openness as unquestionable normative goods without first considering the complexity of how these concepts shapeshift as they move through institutions of power. And before I discuss the specifics of my research, I want to broadly point how I'm thinking about accountability and transparency. And so I have switched the slide, and I see on the live stream, I've got it on a separate computer to see how it's going along. It's not showing up, it's lagging a bit, so I think it will pop up in a couple seconds here. But I'm going to talk now a little bit about how I'm conceptualizing accountability and transparency in governance. So what is accountability and what is transparency? When we use this language and use mechanisms of accountability and transparency to justify critique or political actions, I'm interested in untangling the meanings that these concepts carry and what these practices carry with them. Of course, I think the answers to these what questions are crucial, not only because accountability and transparency have been articulated to us as normative goods and as obligations of responsible liberal democratic governance, but because we live in a world where these concepts are increasingly overdetermined with multiple meanings. We live in an age of transitional justice with social accountability projects, with national projects like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, We also live in a time of crisis. We've spent the last 2 and a bit years now facing a global public health crisis, most of us being asked to make almost instantaneous changes to our day-to-day lives on short notice, and prompting very many visible demands for transparency when it comes to COVID-19 regulation and decision-making. We also live in a time of pronounced and audible social justice demands from marginalized communities. For example, demands for police accountability in relation to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, demands for accountability from the uber rich through appropriate taxation. And these are just some examples of the ways we're hearing accountability and transparency come about in conversations. And at face value, they're all demands for the same thing, accountability and transparency. And so that's where my research begins and where I try to pick up these questions in more depth. So for each concept, you'll see that I've highlighted on this slide some of the ways that accountability and transparency shape-shift in meaning. So before I discuss these forms, I want to stress that I'm not arguing that any of these are the correct forms, any of them are inherently better or more ethical forms of accountability or transparency. But instead, what I'm interested in is how, through discourse and through policy, we begin with a promise and a commitment to ethical responsibility, to the morality of truth-telling, and sort of these lofty, ambitious aspirations. And we end with mechanisms like quality assurance, performance metrics, performance evaluations, and other forms of quantified audits. And so I'll turn now to the data from my doctoral work to provide a framework for how I'm understanding some of these issues and concepts grounded in my case studies. My doctoral work focused on 3 case studies, and here specifically, I'm going to talk about one of those 3, which is the Alberta context. And so I do just want to let folks know that I will be talking to some extent about the deaths of Indigenous children in state care, not in any detail, but I understand that the content still is difficult. And so I want to just give that notice before I get into it. So Serenity was a young First Nations girl who died in the custody of kinship caregivers in 2014. And the year is important here, as many of you will know. 2014 was the last year of the Progressive Conservative Party's dynasty that lasted 40 years in Alberta. And so the political actors do change soon. And the political landscape is already fraught with this sense of deep unaccountability, opacity, an entrenched party and its staffers. And so whether or not this is actually the case isn't the main concern of my work. But the context is still important. Relatively little is said in public discussions at the time of Serenity's death. There's a few news articles released, and then in 2016, the Office of the Child Advocate releases its inquiry findings. The release of this investigative review, labeled with the pseudonym Marie, is what prompts renewed public interest in Serenity's death. Journalist Paula Simons writes a column titled, "Her Name Was Serenity, Never Forget It." In the article, which focuses on ostensible omissions from the Child Advocate's report, Simons emphasizes that Albertans ought to know the name of this child, Serenity, as well as what exactly happened to her. Simons alleges that there were discrepancies across autopsy reports and that this alluded to a crisis of accountability and transparency in the provincial government. Importantly, the debates about whether or not these omissions happened, didn't happen is still ongoing. So this isn't a case where there's a clear-cut resolution. It is still sort of lingering for debate. And what you see in the slide here is one of the data visualizations produced through my coding of discourse. So I use a software called In Vivo, which helps me code patterns in discourse, policy, and so on. And I want to draw attention to the fact that there really are 2 different debates taking place, and that those debates overlap only actually quite minimally. So the first being this discussion about Indigenous children in state care, reconciliation, colonialism, and racism in child welfare. And the second is this conversation of transparency, public concern, and justice. So on this slide, you'll see a second visualization of the same concepts from the software coding. I'm sure it'll update in a moment there for folks on the live stream. So importantly, Serenity's death and the rediscovery of it by the Albertan public 2 years after becomes a scandal of accountability and transparency to the Alberta citizen as an individual taxpayer citizen. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But largely, it is not presented to the public in mass media, in legislative debates, or in policy changes as a scandal of the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system, the legacies of the residential school system, or the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. And again, the political context is important here. This is 2016. The newly elected NDP government is facing an uphill battle to gain public trust and legitimacy in the Conservative province. The former chief medical officer had alleged interference from the Conservative government in the years surrounding the autopsies, and this has been back in the news as recently as the summer. And now there's a public discussion that's emerging not only about the deaths in child welfare, but the work that might be going on within the government and within child welfare bureaucracy more broadly to cover up these deaths. And so that's where I'm really interested in how these two different conversations start to overlap into one another. And I therefore contend that the act of theorizing settler colonialism, especially through these mundane acts of policy and administration, reveals the answers to the previous questions I was talking about in terms of what we are meaning when we mean accountability and transparency. Governmental accountability and transparency are a state of contestation over the legitimacy of settler colonialism itself. So what I mean here is that settler colonialism is performed into reality through a series of relationships. And I'm pretty sure, again, the slide will update shortly. But so I've got on this slide this triangulation of relationships that really comes into play between Indigenous peoples who are framed not as political actors, but as objects of concern for both the taxpayer citizen and the benevolent settler government. So on the one hand, democratic theory tells us that legitimacy is derived from the citizens who consent tacitly or otherwise to being governed. But this theory, as we know, or as we can see, presents an account of legitimacy that completely erases Indigenous sovereignty. And so instead, I propose that theorizing democratic legitimacy through an account of settler colonialism is necessary and shows us the highly contingent and precarious nature of settler governance. Settler colonialism is a precarious state of affairs, and it has to continuously seek reaffirmation through the staging of policy problematizations, which I'll talk about in a moment. These problematizations are produced in conversation with and subsequently brought back to the concerned taxpayer citizen for consultation. In the overdetermined context of accountability that I've already mentioned, where accountability is simultaneously an exercise in policy efficacy and efficiency, as well as, we're told, a transformational and social justice project, the benevolent settler government and its concerned citizens take Indigenous peoples as an object of administration and concern, invisibilizing their sovereign status as a result. This ultimately reaffirms both the settler state and the settler public as concerned interveners with the legitimate authority to create policy that governs Indigenous life. And so I'm going to come back now to this process of problematization and sort of demonstrate how it moves through the different sites. So I looked at 4 different sites: media, legislative debates, reports and inquiries, and finally policy outcomes. And so this process, which I refer to as problematization following critical policy studies, is the negotiation of 2 different political and policy debates entangled into one public scandal concerning the child. So this duality, I argue, reveals what is going on in the triangle of relationships I pointed to earlier. I argue that each data site which I refer to as fields, plays a specific role in the process of problematization. Of course, it's not a neat process and we don't move through the steps clearly and in a linear fashion. So this graph is more of a template to help follow along the steps rather than sort of a step-by-step instructional manual. So I think it's helpful to think through this holistically because it shows us how it is a process and how it does require these various interjections, these various moments of discourse and change to produce the end result. We begin with a moment of scandal, and importantly in this case study, the scandal was not the scandal of a child's death, but rather the scandal of an opaque and unaccountable government. And yet, Serenity is still positioned as the object of concern here, and this is important. The scandal is one of governmental accountability, but the battlefield that it's played out on is the life and death of an Indigenous girl in state care. So as this scandal then moves into the legislature, which happens in a matter of days, the partisan nature of the debates plays out in such a way as to narrate the parameters of the policy problem. So here the scandal grows into two entangled threads. The first is a scandal of public trust. Albertans are not happy with their government because their government is not transparent or accountable to its citizens. And here it's important that citizens are understood directly in their role as taxpayers and investors in the state. So in other words, Albertans, largely in this context, we're intended to see this audience as settler Albertans, want to know why kinship care, a publicly funded program using taxpayer dollars, is not accountable to the tax-paying settler public. And then inevitably, there are transparency mechanisms that are approved in the legislature. In Alberta, it wasn't a full provincial public inquiry as it was in Manitoba, but instead an all-party ministerial panel tasked with making recommendations on the child death review process. Again, this is important because what the committee is mandated to do and what they go on to do are not fully in sync. Most of the recommendations ultimately focus on developing increased professionalization and training of kinship caregivers, as well as more internal mechanisms of quality assurance within child services ministry. So here we're talking about things like numbers of caseloads, we're talking about numbers of children. So what is the status of overrepresentation? We're also talking about things like how long are children in care for, how many different homes do they end up in? So what I argue happens here in the discussion and determination of who is responsible includes a debate about who is responsible for providing care, especially in this case, to Indigenous peoples and their children. And again, Indigenous peoples having been often the recipients of government intervention, but rarely the recipients of government care. And this process of deliberating responsibility, the settler state uses its own transparency mechanism, the ministerial panel, to reaffirm its role as the benevolent settler intervener into Indigenous families who are ostensibly incapable of being accountable or responsible themselves. Of course, I want to emphasize this isn't true, but this is how the story is presented to us as the Albertan public. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, the ministerial panel releases its recommendations, which almost exclusively focus on quality assurance and professionalization. In other words, the private sector strategies of new public management. And these are offered to the Albertan public as the best mechanisms of social justice and reconciliation, whereby we're told, if we monitor government efficiency and quality closely enough, we're also monitoring governmental ethics and responses to ethical, political, social crises. And so, just to reiterate that concept of problematization that I was talking about earlier, you may have noticed the second column on those slides referred to the role in the process, suggesting that each different research site is part of a trajectory. And this is intentional. I analyze this trajectory as a holistic project. And And I think it's best understood as a form of problematization or a process of problematization, which we can think about as the making of political problems. So in other words, the concept of problematization is helpful in considering why some issues are articulated and understood as political problems while others are not and do not register in the public consciousness in the same way. I then argue that something interconnected is happening in this assemblage of materials, documents, discourses, political actions. More simply, I'm arguing that the process of problematization, so again, this process where we come to see and understand things as problems on a political level and then respond to them using policy interventions, in this case, brings three different phenomena together. The first is new public management, or NPM, and the importation of private sector strategies into the public service. The second is the concept of settler benevolence, which describes the historical and contemporary interventions into Indigenous life under the ostensible banner of what we're told is a philanthropic agenda. So in the past, this was articulated along the lines of projects like Christianity or projects like the welfare state. But in the context of new public management, it inherits new language like continuous improvement and capacity building. So continuous improvement, which comes into being specifically through the interplay between settler benevolence and NPM, is the third concept, but again, importantly, a product of the assemblage of the first two. So in my doctoral work, I examined accountability and transparency in provincial child death inquiries across Canada. And I'll bring now my three core arguments to the forefront before sort of turning to a more general thought process around accountability and transparency. So the first, so these three core arguments and what I've tried to reveal both in my writing and in this presentation today is that the Albertan public, understood to be taxpayer citizens, is offered strategies of new public management, things like internal quality assurance and quantified indicators of progress, as evidence of a government that is hard at work and committed to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And so when I say this is offered to the Albertan public, again, I do really mean this as the settler, tax-paying Albertan public is the audience. So the audience of these policy changes, of these reports, is not intended in the ways they are presented to speak directly to Indigenous nations. It's intended to speak to taxpayers as individuals, as evidence of their government's work. So building on that, we see the importance of an invested settler public. Invested both fiscally as taxpayers and invested emotionally as concerned about the well-being of Indigenous children in state care. And I want to pause and say that even as I'm critiquing this, I know that very likely the intentions of many of the public involved are probably mostly good. But I do want to push us to think about the ways that the fact that the care of Indigenous children is predominantly a negotiation of public trust between quote unquote Albertans and their government is part of the process of ongoing settler colonial management. And it's how settler colonial governments give credibility not only to the creation of settler colonial policies and the ways that they govern Indigenous peoples, but they also grant legitimacy to these commitments to always make settler colonial policies a little bit better, a little bit nicer. And finally, this takes me to my final argument, which is that one of the mundane and often invisible ways that settler colonial power legitimizes itself through these commitments is this notion of continuous improvement. So this idea that we can continuously improve, we can commit to developing settler colonial policy that is always a little bit better, always a little bit more compassionate, always a little bit more trustworthy, a little bit more responsible. And part of this is doing the making of the policies itself, the internal quality assurance mechanisms, for example. But part of it is in the process of admitting any wrongdoing in the past, which provides the opportunity to quote unquote start again and continuously improve from these moments of scandal and apology that the settler state and the settler society have narrated for themselves. And so I want to return now to the different ways of thinking through accountability and transparency that I highlighted earlier, and given the case studies of my doctoral work, argue that the hegemonic understanding of accountability and transparency, as they circulate in institutions of power, like legislatures, like mainstream media, universities, these are understandings that privilege logics like quality assurance, audits, performance management, sound fiscal investment. And certainly this doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of understanding accountability and transparency, but it does mean that all these other ways are being absorbed into this assemblage of new public management. And so they're made to take on meanings associated with the private sector, notions of expertise and financialization, even as we continue to hear other iterations entangled with morality, truth, democracy, reconciliation, all entangled into these assemblages. So while new public management is certainly not the only factor at play in shaping contemporary understandings of accountability and transparency, its saturation of Canadian public policy, the Canadian political landscape more broadly, has produced particular connotations of accountability and transparency. And I contend that we need to examine these understandings more rigorously before we unconditionally accept measures like quality assurance indicators and performance audits as acceptable solutions to deeply political issues. And so to wrap up my talk for today, I'm going to turn to two examples that might well be referred to as opening the university, where what open, accountable, and transparent governance looks like is largely shaped by new public management and its market logics. I'll start off with the example of Alberta first, because it's the most recent example. This is passed as part of the 2022 provincial budget. And as well as the one that has the most direct implications for the work that's done both here at the University of Lethbridge and in the School of Liberal Education particularly. The 2022 provincial budget included the initiation of the Alberta at Work program and its related funding provisions for post-secondary education. The program is touted by the government as an increase in investment in post-secondary, especially for, quote, high demand programs in key economic areas, end quote. However, research done by Alex Usher at the Higher Education Strategy Associates, as shown in the graph on this slide, demonstrates that funding for post-secondary education in Alberta has in fact decreased 9% in the 2022 to 23 academic year, and an astounding 31% over the last 5 years. In this example, the discourse of accountability has come to take on the meaning of responsible investment of taxpayer dollars. And we see this in this top sort of quote on the slide here, where we talk about, Alberta taxpayers make a significant investment in Alberta's post-secondary system and expect it to be responsible and accountable for value of investment. So here we really see this discourse of accountability taking on the meanings of, sorry, there's a fly buzzing around me. That's why I'm swatting at the air right now. So this understanding of accountability takes on a notion of responsible investment of tax dollars with the assumption that the task of the provincial government is to see a return on investment and to see more economic growth. Now, this may be something that folks in the audience hold to be true, and it's certainly something that is generally accepted as fact in our current political context, but it hasn't always been this way, and it doesn't have to be this way. This isn't the only way to understand accountability. Those among us who study anything related to neoliberalism or late capitalism will be familiar with the notion that ours is a time of the marketization of everything. And so when I look at these kinds of funding protocols, what's concerning to me is the ways in which the program is premised in a belief that the free market is good at determining what a society needs. And so I'll get to that a little bit more depth in the Ontario case study, which I'll turn to now. And this is where you really see these ideas that the free market knows how to dictate what is right or good in a society. So the second case study, what very likely served as the template for Alberta's 2022 strategy, is Ontario's creation of performance-based funding for post-secondary education in 2020. Of course, these are neither the first two nor the only two instances of performance-based funding in higher education, but they are two recent, prominent, and very explicit examples from the Canadian context, which is why I've chosen to highlight them here. So again, we see the logics of responsible investment of tax dollars as the primary and accepted evidence of accountability and transparency. Universities will become more accountable to the taxpayer citizen by transparently evaluating, funding, and supporting programs that have, quote, positive economic outcomes for Ontario, end quote. And then we can look at what these accountability metrics actually are. And we once again see a very strong push to understand the primary and perhaps even sole purpose of academic institutions to be one of responsible fiscal investment and the promotion of economic growth. Many of the indicators used to determine future funding for programs and institutions is directly correlated to the potential of those programs to generate wealth for students as individuals, as we see sort of in these earlier notions of graduate employment earnings, how much are students making once they graduate, or graduate employment in a related field. And I'm going to turn to this in a moment, but of course, those of us in the room can probably imagine how something like liberal education doesn't have an obvious related field because it's so many different fields. And so these programs are measured, evaluated, audited in terms of their possibilities to generate wealth and expand economic growth and development. And so, as I alluded to, in terms of those of us in fields like liberal education, whether or not interdisciplinary, humanities-based, different kinds of programs like that, it's sort of unspoken but self-evident for those of us in these areas that what we're teaching is less likely to generate wealth, obviously, and less likely to have obvious employment outcomes or economic impacts. And though I do also want to emphasize, certainly not none. So even if this is a value system that you ascribe to, the programs do this, just not in always the most obvious way as a one-to-one. You trained to become this, and you are this, and therefore the program is successful. So as I was preparing my slides for the symposium, this tweet popped up on my social media. And while it might seem extreme, it wasn't that long ago that I was sitting in my apartment in January 2022, teaching a class on social change in Canada to students, most of whom had never seen the inside of a university building, while trucks with swastika flags sat parked on my neighbor's driveway and drove up and down the main road right by my apartment. Many of my racialized, queer, Indigenous, trans women, femme friends and students were scared to go outside. So this, of course, was January 2022. We were just about to reopen the university as COVID cases were dying down again. And then Carleton had to close the university again because it was declared unsafe to expect students and staff to commute to the campus. And I can't help but think of this as a question of academic accountability too. Not one that's measured by, the potential earnings of students in that class or what jobs they'll have in the future. But I do think of it as academic accountability in terms of holding space where I could have in the same class, students expressing their support for this movement and other students communicating the loss of credibility that the convoy had the moment that hate symbols became normalized in their living spaces. I was accountable to my students not to change their mind or to make them think the way that I think, but I was accountable to give them the critical thinking skills and the historical and political contexts to evaluate how it can be that we might live in a time where hate symbols are appearing in public spaces. And again, even if this was a small minority of those actually involved, it's not so much that as the fact that this could happen in 2022. Again, it's unlikely that this moment contributed very much to Ontario's academic or economic growth, rather. I hope it contributed a lot to its academic growth. It's unlikely that the performance-based metrics used to evaluate the relevance of universities would see classes like that one on social change in Canada. These are likely to be cut and replaced with courses that more neatly align with economic objectives, key economic fields, high demand areas. I don't think social justice makes the cut in that one. But at the same time, I remember this class very fondly as, of course, not the specific moment of the class, but as a whole, as formative to my own learning, and I hope to my students' learning as well. I like to think of it in retrospect as an example of what the aspiration of opening the university might look like from a different standpoint. So if instead of accepting that opening the university means opening its wealth generating potential or opening it to taxpayer investor scrutiny about its potential to provide a compelling return on investment, we consider opening in different ways, opening spaces for hard conversations, opening spaces for critical thinking, opening spaces for sometimes ugly disagreements. And for me, this also means knowing the limits of opening, at what point the harms of openness outweigh the benefits, for example. And this is a really tricky line to follow. And I think that the goals of this symposium today are really hopeful. And I'm looking forward to taking this day to reflect as a community on what we do in terms of muddling through this complexity together. And so I'm very much looking forward to the other speakers and the panel this afternoon. And so as I wrap up, I would just like to thank everyone again for being here today, and the School of Liberal Education, Shelley in particular, for inviting me to share some of my thoughts today. For those of you who don't know me, my email's up on the last slide here, and I would love to connect with you. So please do reach out if you have any questions, comments, you just want to chat. I'm new to uLethbridge and very much looking forward to having these conversations here in this space and in this place. So in the meantime, I'm looking forward to the rest of the speakers today. So I'll wrap up here so that we can hear other perspectives. But thank you again for listening, and thank you for bearing with us early on in the technical issues. I'm really glad to see that I believe it has worked. So looking forward to the rest of the afternoon.